Riot Chapter 14. Over 100 men were gathered on the street outside the housing camp. Brian walked his bike off the path and into the dewy goldenrod and grass, soaking his jeans. He tried to make his motions casual and natural. He didn't want anyone to notice him, especially his father. 20, maybe 30 yards from the road, he put down his kickstand and squatted in the weeds, watching. Some man sipped up white styrofoam cups. Most looked edgy, glancing back and forth, milling about, as though they needed a leader. Brian took a breath. This wasn't frightening, not the way of the passing trucks men had made him feel. He'd overreacted. He took the video camera from its case, removed the cap lens, and lifted the camera to his shoulder like a news reporter. A van with a camera on top and KBLH News painted on the rainbow colors across its side drove slowly from the west, from the direction of the Border Mall and Pizza Hut, toward the crowd. It wove around the men in the street. Brian had the right idea. This was history in the making. He pressed the on button, and the camera buzzed next to his ear. He spoke. September 9th. History in the making. He stopped talking. He'd rather watch and film. Kyle could do it better. He'd find some way to make it all sound funny. Inside the housing camp, 2 men stood by the guardhouse. Brian recognized the wide-shouldered man, the hired bulldog, taking shelter behind the closed steel gate. Beyond him, 2 blue charter buses were parked. The housing camp looked strangely quiet. Saturday morning. Were all the baguette workers still sleeping? A dozen law enforcement officers paced back and forth inside, all wearing protective helmets, all except one, Sheriff Hunter. The sheriff talked with the police officers on his side of the fence, and then with the protesters on the other side. It was good to see the sheriff out there. He'd keep things under control. He hadn't needed Brian's warning after all. Minutes passed slowly. More pickup trucks pulled alongside the curb. More men joined the growing crowd. Brian shuddered. The sheriff's force looked smaller by the moment. If things got out of control, how could the sheriff and the small police force possibly hold back so many men? The back of Brian's throat burned. The news truck edged down the street and stopped. A lean, long-legged man with wire glasses hopped out, springing ahead, his camera on his shoulder. "Get that blasted camera out of here," a man shouted. 2 burly men grabbed the newsman by either arm and dragged him back to his van. The camera crashed to the ground. "Hey," the newsman shouted as they shoved him toward the van. "You can't." Brian's heart beat faster. He wiped his wet palms on his jeans, and then he tried to zoom closer to find the reporter's camera beneath the shuddering feet. It was gone. Why were they so uptight about cameras? Wasn't this a free country? For a few more minutes, men milled about, as if at a friendly social. Then, as if responding to an unseen signal, they picked up gravel, just as Brian had done, and pelted it over the fence at the mobile home windows. Crack, kaping, crack. Glass shattered. A mobile home window fell in shards to the ground. "Stupid rats," someone yelled. Suddenly, a young mustached man from a group shouted, "Well, are we going to do it, or are we just going to talk?" He walked into the crowd, raising his arms into the air as if he were preaching a sermon. "Let's do what we came here to do." The crowd divided into 2, one group pushing toward the fence, the others hanging back in the street. "Come on," the man with the mustache yelled. "Let's get this job done once and for all. Are you a bunch of chickens?" Get what done? What were they going to do? Brian bit down hard on his inner lip. He pressed the camera against his face. One man, well over 6 feet tall, towered above the others. Brian had seen him at the strike site once. He shouted in a deep voice, "It doesn't look like anybody's here, guys. We may as well go home." "Hey, stupid, if you're not with us, then you go home. We don't need bystanders. Let's finish the job." Brian bit hard on his inner lip and tasted blood. His whole body tingled, as though it were a clam closing in on itself. He shrunk lower in the grass, dropping his elbows in his stomach. He crawled to a slope where he could look on, his zoom lens poking through the weeds. One group of men stretched a line across the portion of fence. "Come on, push!" The high metal fence bent slowly, as easily as an aluminum can. The men cheered, raising their fists high. "Rats go home! Rats go home!" The air was littered with 4-letter words. With war whoops, the men swarmed over the portion of down fence that stretched 20 yards from the empty guardhouse. On the edge of the street, yards away from the crowd, Nancy Benton, in a brown leather jacket and jeans, held a camera to her face. One of the strikers turned and pointed. Brian wished he could have warned her. 3 men strode toward her. She lowered her camera and stepped backwards. No cameras, one man yelled, tearing the camera from her neck and throwing it to the ground. He put his boot on it and glared at her. Nancy Benson spun away. She dashed away in her silver car, scrambled in, and sped east, wheels squealing. Trembling, Brian reached over to his bike and yanked at the kickstand and let it fall in the grass beside him. Kathunk. What would happen if someone saw him filming? He eyed the woods. If he left now... When he returned to his lens, the crowd looked like a giant amoeba, the kind he'd watch under a microscope at Mr. Crawford's science class last year. A single-cell organism that changed shape as it moved, falling forward. Two men straggled behind and ran to catch up with the group. They looked over their shoulders nervously as if someone might see them alone, knowing the group meant safety. In moments, the individuals blended in and disappeared. Sheriff Hunter held a radio to his mouth as his handful of officers clustered together at the edge of the fence, like shy children on the edge of the schoolyard. "Hey, Sheriff," someone yelled. "Where's your National Guard, huh?" National Guard? Are they supposed to help the sheriff? Suddenly the men swarmed around the mobile homes, wielding baseball bats that must have been hidden under their jackets. Brian focused on the moving mass and the blur of legs and arms, relieved not to see his father among them. For a few moments the men moved out of sight behind the first row of mobile homes. One yellow mobile home leaned slowly, rocking on its brick foundation, then crashed to the side. Dust and shouting filled the air. "We'll show those suckers." Brian shook his head slowly, his mouth sour. A group of men emerged from behind a mobile home and encircled a blue bus. "Rocket!" From either side they pushed it, rocking and groaning the bus back and forth. "There she goes!" On its side, the wheels, the bus hung for a moment and then creaked and fell to the ground with a slam. Men were laughing and slapping each other on the back and high-fiving. Grass and weeds brushed against Brian's camera lens as trucks rolled past, momentarily blocking his shot. A hornet hovered above his hand, buzzing, and then flew on. How could grown men, fathers, and grandfathers do this? Sitting up to a crouch, Brian was determined to film as much as he could. Men, increasingly jubilant, swarmed in and out of the mobile homes. One man with a black cap and a red bandana pulled over his face swung a baseball bat at a glass window. It shattered to the ground, leaving a gaping hole. The man tugged at the rose curtains hanging there and pulled them outside. Then he reached down to the ground. Brian zoomed his focus closer. The man lifted a flaming rag to the curtains and lit them, and tossed the rag through the window. Within seconds, smoke seeped out the window. In less than a minute, smoke poured from the mobile home. As the man glanced toward the street, the bandana fell from his face. Brian focused right on the face. It was Dad. Brian dropped the camera. He covered his mouth with his hand and shut his eyes. His chest heaved with a silent cry. How could he? Was Dad crazy too? He was the same as all the other men. Hornets defeating their hive, stinging their intruders, and killing themselves in the process. Brian rose to his knees, grabbed a clump of weeds, and ripped it out by the roots. He flung it toward the street. So what if his father or anyone saw him? His father could be part of this. Then maybe nothing mattered anymore. The camera buzzed in the ground, the lens in the dirt. Hands shaking, Ryan picked it up and brushed away the dirt particles and bits of grass. He lifted it and refocused, but he couldn't find his father anywhere. Flames burst skyward from the mobile homes his father had torched, and from a dozen other homes in the camp. Smoke, gray, wispy, rose slithering to the sky. It billowed into a dark pillar fed by dozens of smaller fires until it towed ominous and black above the whole town. In the distance, sirens screamed, building to a deafening high pitch. Fire trucks sped around the corner from the west and zoomed toward the site. One fireman climbed out and started. Then he raced with a hose toward the fire hydrant. Within the camp, a dozen men approached an olive green car. The car began moving. Men pelted the car with rocks as it increased speed and screeched through the open gate. Its driver was wide-eyed. In the passenger seat, the housing camp guard was slumped forward, hands pressed to his bloody forehead. If they hadn't escaped, they would have been killed. Brian knew it. If the baguette workers had been there, many would have died. He shivered and flattened himself to the ground, the damp earth chilling his skin. Small groups of men melded back into an amoeba again, into a mob, and they flowed out of the camp through the down fence. Brian held his breath. He didn't move. If they decided to cross the field now, he'd be dead. Finally, when voices and footsteps faded, Brian lifted his head. He rose to a cramped, stiffed his knees, and unclenched his hands. The amoeba moved away without anyone guiding it, moving slowly down the street to the west and then onto the highway. The mob grew smaller as it moved down the highway, between the community college and the Holiday Inn, with 3 police cars following slowly behind, as if they were at the tail of a parade. Some parade. When the mob continued on, not stopping at the Holiday Inn, but flowing toward the center of town, toward the mill, Brian let out a shaky groan. All through his body and head, he felt badly bruised. A fire engine roared from the east toward the camp, sirens shrieking. Beneath the black mushroom cloud, firefighters shot white arcs of water into the smoke and flames. On wobbly legs, Brian stood up. His mouth hung open, dry and dusty, and the morning sun beat down on his head. "Dad," he whispered.